Hello everyone, thank you for signing in and watching my live stream. I'm Mr. Matt and this is Dr. Tot. And welcome to SAT ACT Prep. Today's a writing skills day. It's commas part 2. So we're going to get to 6 rules that we didn't get to last week that pertain to commas. And we're going to have a lot of other work with commas as well. If you didn't see part 1 and you're watching this recording, I would highly recommend that you watch part 1. We get into the discussion of how to identify or discern between independent and dependent clauses. I'm going to go through a rough overview of that before we get into the actual rules today, but it is really important, especially for commas, to understand the difference between independent and dependent clauses. So the gist of it is that an independent clause can stand on its own. It's independent, meaning that it's a complete sentence or could be a complete sentence. You can combine independent clauses together, and we went over the rule that pertains to that. You need a comma conjunction in order to combine 2 independent clauses, 2 complete sentences. Without them, you'd have a comma splice. That's when you try and put 2 complete sentences together without a conjunction, just a comma. It's only appropriate to use solely a comma if you have a dependent comma independent clause. Now, a dependent clause is just what the name implies. It's dependent on another clause to be a complete sentence. In general, a complete sentence has a subject and a verb. That's really all that it needs. There's also another diagrammatical way of understanding a sentence being a subject and then the predicate, which includes the verb. The predicate is a fancy word for everything else in a sentence. It just provides extra detail. But really, a subject and a verb is all that you need. So I ran, period. That's a complete sentence. So it is important to be able to investigate clauses and sentences based on their grammatical structures because appearances can be deceiving. So just because a clause is short doesn't mean that it can't be a complete sentence. And conversely, just because a clause is very long doesn't mean that it's a complete sentence either. So it goes hand in hand. You really have to understand the rules that are governing the commas or governing the punctuation in order to understand whether the correction is valid or not. If you have any questions, please let me know. Today we do have a hard copy that we'll be working with. I recognize the reading and the writing sections are a little bit hard just to look off of the digital screen. So from now on, I'm going to be providing a hard copy. I put the instructions in the live chat feed. I hope that everybody can see it, even if you've joined it afterwards. I'm going to paste the link again right now. But if you go to that link, or if you go to clcenters.com, and then go to their blog and scroll all the way to the bottom. Actually, I have the instructions right here. There's a tab, or there's a title called Extra Material, and then under that is material for our date, November 12th, 2020. And it's the file called SAT Prep Writing Skills, Commas, Part 2. And each document is going to have a unique reference number. Oops. And so you can always, there's going to be a lot of documents that will be coming out, but you can always understand or be sure that you have the right document by looking at the reference number. And the reference number for today is 1702-4. So as long as your PDF, your document has that number in the upper right-hand corner, then you are all good. If you have any trouble with that, just let me know. This is what it should look like, or the start of it. Okay, so rule number 1. When 2 adjectives are next to each other, you must examine whether they equally apply to the noun independently, or whether they are layering their meaning in groups. In other words, are the adjectives interchangeable? If you can switch them around, then you do use a comma. If you cannot switch them around, then you do not use a comma. And this rule can be a little bit tricky sometimes. So for example, the smooth, circular edge was professionally sanded. Notice that smooth applies to the noun edge equally as circular does. It's a smooth edge and it's a circular edge. And we could switch that around and it would still make fine sense. We could say the circular smooth edge was professionally sanded. So because we can switch them around, we do use a comma. It goes hand in hand. That's how I remember this rule. The second example, however, I don't like that musky aerosol spray. So here, musky and aerosol are two adjectives that are modifying spray, but they're not modifying spray equally. Here, aerosol is directly modifying spray. It's an aerosol spray. Musky is modifying the total aerosol spray. So it's almost like an onion layer effect going on. So you have to understand, and also if you tried to switch these words around, if you tried to say, I don't like that aerosol musky spray, that doesn't make sense because the aerosol needs to be closest to spray because that's part of the inherent characterization of what the item is. The musky is just an external or it's a secondary characteristic. The primary characteristic that it's an aerosol spray, that's part of its identity. The muskiness is just a characteristic of its odor. And you're going to see that in some other examples where, especially with color, color is like the yellow house or the green pair of pants, something like that. So color is usually implied to be an inherent characteristic that's closely linked to the item's identification. So usually that's going to have to come right before the noun that it modifies, whereas the other adjective is modifying the whole thing, like the big red house, right? You wouldn't say the red big house. It doesn't make sense. If you have any questions about that, please let me know. Rule number 2 has to do with parenthetical clauses. So parenthetical clauses are like it's a big umbrella of a bunch of other terms, just like metaphors. There are many things that are considered a metaphor or types of metaphors. There are different types of parenthetical clauses, like an apositive clause is a type of parenthetical clause. An absolute clause is a type of parenthetical clause. That's not really that important, especially for the SAT, to be able to label different clauses. However, it is important to understand that parenthetical clauses provide extra information, non-essential information in sentences. So they give detail, they give color, and they also have a remarkable ability to change the tone or to shift tone in a sentence by having this dramatic or declarative statement that's injected into the middle of the clause. Parenthetical clauses must be surrounded by commas, or another thing is dashes. So you could use 2 commas or 2 dashes, but never a combination of the two. So they do test that a lot. If they start off with a comma, then you have to end with a comma. If you start off with a dash, then you have to end with a dash. You might ask then what's the difference between a comma and a dash, and we'll get into that in other lessons. The short answer to that is that the dash is a really versatile punctuation mark, and it can be used in many places where a lot of other punctuation marks have very strict rules that govern their placement. So the dash can be a way of providing emphasis to a reader, especially if you've already used a certain type of punctuation mark several times before. So it's a way of highlighting something or making a dramatic declarative statement pop. But we'll get more into that when we get to the actual dash lesson. So, for example, when I arrive home, comma, which will probably be later than I originally said, comma, we can start preparing for the party. So notice that the essential meaning of this sentence is when I arrive home, we can start preparing for the party. This sentence in here is just extra non-essential information. So it needs to be offset with 2 commas or 2 dashes. So this could also be like this. But like I said, never a combination of the two. You can't do comma dash or you can't do dash comma. It has to be comma comma or dash dash. The second example, the dog and the cat, both of whom have known each other, have known each other, should be an N in there, known, my apologies, both of whom have known each other since birth, get along great. So again, the essential meaning is that the dog and the cat get along great. This extra information, both of whom have known each other since birth, is extra information. So it needs to be offset by 2 commas. Rule number 3, a comma can be used to separate a statement from a question. So for example, that is my water bottle, isn't it? So we have a statement, a dependent clause that could stand on its own as a complete sentence. That is my water bottle. But we're attaching to it this interrogative. It's a fancy word for a question. And so it is appropriate to separate those two with just a comma. Second example, I think you should check on grandma, shouldn't you? So again, we have an independent clause, I think you should check on grandma, separated from this question, shouldn't you? And that shouldn't is a contraction for should not, right? That's what the apostrophe means, that we're omitting the O there. If you have any questions, then please let me know. Rule number 4, when writing a complete formal date, the year must be surrounded by commas when it occurs mid-sentence. If you use any other date format other than the formal day, month, and year, then you do not use commas. So for example, a date of June 4th, 2021 has been set for the wedding. Notice that the year, because it's in the formal date format, and it occurs mid-sentence, the year is surrounded by commas. Now, what you're going to see is that, especially when you get into college and if you get into some upper-level English classes, a lot of comma rules are quite flexible and are a matter of preference and what type of stylistic manual you're following. So I just want to warn you that you will see a lot of deviation in some of these rules because they are flexible. The main overarching principle of grammar is that in your own writing, there are some things that you get to choose grammatically how you'd like to structure your sentences or paragraphs or your writing in general. And it's not so much what you choose to do, but how consistent you are in that choice. And so just so long as you don't switch back and forth, you're not going to be violating a lot, you're not going to be the subject of a lot of ridicule on that. There's some forgiveness and flexibility in the rules. But the main thing is that you can't switch back and forth, especially in the same piece of writing. The second example, however, says the wedding will be in June 2021. So now we don't have a formal day, month, and year format, so no commas are required. Rule number 5, there must be a comma between city-state combinations, and commas must surround them when they occur mid-sentence. You might be seeing a theme here that a lot of these abbreviations, The last week we talked about IE versus EG versus etc. We also talked about the suffixes junior and senior for people's names. All of those things, when they occur, people's titles, like a medical doctor has MD after his or her name, all of those things, when they occur mid-sentence, have to be surrounded by commas. So for example, that route will take us through Houston, comma, Texas, comma. Notice the comma after Texas. Most people omit that. Right around the same time as the hurricane is due to make landfall. Or the second example, I moved from Alexandria, comma, Virginia, comma, to New York City, comma, New York, comma, in February of last year. So when they occur mid-sentence, the states need to be surrounded with commas. Now the last rule is a little tricky, and the last rule confuses even very astute linguists. So non-essential information should be surrounded by commas. Essential information takes no commas because the clause is necessary to identify the individual subject of the action. The choice by a writer to include or exclude a set of commas allows the reader to make inferences about the subject. So let's just look at some examples. That might sound like a lot of Latin, or might not make much sense in other words, but let's look at some examples. So, for example, my sister, comma, Diane, comma, is a great artist, versus the second example, my sister Diane is a great artist, no commas. So both of these are actually grammatically correct. They mean or imply two different things. So in the first example, Diane is surrounded by commas. This implies that it's non-essential information, and the only reason that my sister's name, my specific sister of whom I'm speaking, her name, the only reason her name would be non-essential is if I only had one sister to speak of. So there is a very subtle implication in the punctuation. In the second example, my sister Diane, I have no commas. That's implying that her name is essential to the identification of which sister I'm speaking of, so of whom I'm speaking. So that implies that I have more than one sister, and that I need to tell you that it's Diane, that Diane is the one who's the great artist and not any of the others. If there's any questions on that, let me know. Another example, set of examples here. So his book, comma, Into the Forest, comma, was a bestseller, versus his book Into the Forest was a bestseller. So if I put commas around the title of the book, that's implying that the title is non-essential to the identification of the subject, meaning that he only wrote one book, so what other book would I be thinking of, or what other book would I be referencing? In the second example, however, I don't have any commas, so it's implied that the name of the book is essential to the identification of the subject, so therefore it's implying that he wrote more than one book, and therefore it's essential for me to label the book of which I'm speaking. If you have any questions, then please let me know. That is very tricky, but we're going to get some practice with it today and moving forward. So I just have, there are two practice sets on each page. I just want to do one set at a time because I really think that it's a lot more impactful for you to make some mistakes in a cluster and then try it again in a new cluster versus just doing all of them at once and then checking your mistakes or checking whether you got it correct or not. So I just want you to look at practice set A. That's why I kind of blacked out practice set B. I understand that you have it in front of you, but I really want you to resist the urge to just go and do all of them at once because it is helpful to go through them and then approach them in clusters. So I'm going to give you 6 minutes, 1 minute per question, and then we'll review, and then we'll go through set B. I'll keep track of the time in the upper left-hand corner, and I'll update it per minute. Okay, so let's look at these. And I do apologize, there were two typos in number 3. It said one and it should be once, and then her rather than here. So I apologize. It says it should be but once you get here. Number 1, his youngest brother David lives in Miami, Florida. So this one is a little bit tricky. Notice that we have the superlative adjective youngest. Youngest is in the superlative form, meaning that there is no one younger than this person, David. So there is only one youngest brother. If you had just his brother David, then David, if it just said his brother David, then the name David would be essential to the identification of the subject, the individual that is doing the action of living in Miami. But here it's the youngest brother. There's only one youngest brother. Therefore, David is actually non-essential information, and because it's occurring mid-sentence, it should be surrounded by commas. Then also we have Miami, Florida. So there should be a comma between Miami and Florida. Number 2, the big yellow house stood out among the rest. So we wouldn't be able to say the yellow big house, because like I said before, color is usually thought of as being a more primary characteristic than the overall size. I know that that's a little bit of a gray area there, but it wouldn't make sense to say the yellow big house. So here, because we cannot switch them around, we do not use a comma, so this is actually correct, except that it needs a period at the end. Number 3, so I'll put a little check mark next to 2 because it's correct. I know that the trip is long, not to mention treacherous, but once you get here, you won't have to worry about traveling until you leave in a month. So let's diagram this out because this is a rather long sentence. So I know that the trip is long. That's an independent clause. And then we have, once you get here, you won't have to worry about traveling until you leave in a month. And then we have this parenthetical clause, let me get another color here, not to mention treacherous. So we need to make sure that there are commas surrounding the parenthetical clause, not to mention treacherous. You can almost hear that tone change in the sentence. I know that the trip is long, not to mention treacherous. But once you get here, and then that's a dependent clause. Actually, let me back this out so we can separate the dependent and independent clause. Once you get here, dependent clause, then we need a comma between the dependent and independent clause. You won't have to worry about traveling until you leave in a month. So the red portions are independent clauses. They could stand on their own. And so notice that in between the independent clauses is this conjunction but. We have a comma conjunction. And then the green phrases, this is a dependent clause. This is dependent and parenthetical. Two different types of classification. But because it's parenthetical, occurring mid-sentence, it needs to be surrounded by 2 commas or 2 dashes. 2 commas is the more common usage. Number 4, he's going home to Memphis, Tennessee on Monday, January 4th, 2020 for 2 weeks. Okay, so he's going home to Memphis, comma, Tennessee, comma, on Monday, comma, January 4th, comma, 2021, comma, for 2 weeks. Number 5, you can ask him for a ride, can't you? So we have a statement, you can ask him for a ride, and then we have a question, can't you? So we're going to need a comma to separate the statement from the question in between ride and can't. And number 6, he is a nice, funny man. So here, we could very easily say he is a funny, nice man. So because we can switch them around, we can switch these adjectives around, and because these adjectives are equally applying to the noun man, we can switch them around, so we do use a comma. So we need a comma between nice and funny. If you have any questions, then please let me know. Oops. Hold on. Okay. Otherwise, I'd like to look at practice set B. I'll give you another 6 minutes, and then we'll review. Okay, so let's look at these. Number one, whether or not there is rain, and I am hoping that there is rain, I am going to plant the crops in the field. So if we diagram this out, we have whether or not there is rain. That conditional word whether makes this a dependent clause. So that first clause is dependent. The second clause, and I am hoping that there is rain, that's parenthetical, that's outside the essential meaning. Sorry, parenthetical. And then this last clause, I am going to plant the crops in the field. That's an independent clause. You have a subject, verb, and predicate. So we need to surround the parenthetical clause with commas. And that's it. That takes up, and we would also need to make sure that there's a comma between any dependent and independent clause. Between the blue and the green, there needs to be a comma, but because we have this insertion of a parenthetical clause in between them already, that takes care of the comma that's necessary. So we already have that. So we just need to surround that parenthetical orange clause, and I am hoping that there is rain, with commas. And you can tell it's parenthetical from the tone change that you hear in your mind's ear. So whether or not there is rain, and I am hoping that there is rain, I am going to plant the crops in the field. So it interrupts the flow of the sentence, and your mind's ear could be very sensitive to that. As a native English speaker, you have the gift of that your mother's tongue little bell in your mind where, and you can't trust that bell all the time, but there is that little thing, that little, your mind's ear, to for lack of a better phrase, where you may not know how to correct something, but you know something isn't grammatically on point or doesn't sound right. You can use that, and that's very sensitive to those tone shift clauses. So anytime you hear that type of tone shift, that's usually indicative that that it's a parenthetical clause and that it would need to be surrounded by commas if it's occurring mid-sentence. Number two, the clown was wearing a blue polka-dotted yellow shirt. So we got a whole bunch of adjectives next to each other. We have blue, then we have the compound adjective polka-dotted, and then we have yellow. Okay, so that's a lot. Now, would it make sense to switch these adjectives around? Remember that the rule governing double adjective modification is that if you can switch the adjectives around, you do use commas. If you cannot switch the adjectives around, or in other words, it would not make sense to switch the adjectives around, then you cannot use commas, or you do not use commas. So here, we could not say, would it make sense at least to say that the clown was wearing a polka-dotted blue-yellow shirt? That's mixing up all the colors and it's making it very confusing. So we need to make sure the order does matter. Ordination is important here in the way that the modifications are presented. So blue and polka-dotted need to be in a specific order, where blue is modifying polka-dotted yellow shirt, polka-dotted is modifying yellow shirt, and yellow is modifying shirt. So you kind of have this onion effect going on. Yellow is modifying shirt, polka-dotted is modifying yellow shirt, and blue is modifying polka-dotted yellow shirt. So because we cannot switch them around, we do not use commas, and so number two is actually correct. Number three, he isn't in our class, is he? So we have a statement, he isn't in our class, and then we have a question, is he? So we can use a comma to separate a statement from a question. So we need a comma between class and is. Number four, his cousin who lives in Los Angeles is looking for a job. So here, his cousin who lives in Los Angeles, normally that clause, who lives in Los Angeles, would normally be considered non-essential to the meaning of this sentence, but understand that without it, we don't know the specific individual of whom we're speaking. So I don't know which cousin of his we're speaking unless I know, oh, it's the one who lives in Los Angeles. So here this clause, who lives in Los Angeles, is essential to the identification of the subject. So because it is essential, we do not use commas, and so number 4 is correct. If, for example, it said his oldest cousin, then we would have to use commas, because then we have a superlative and there's only one oldest cousin. But because it's vague, because it just says his cousin and we don't know which cousin he's speaking of, or if you were to imply that he only had one cousin, then you would use commas. Number 5, there's a lot of cloudy, rainy weather in Seattle, Washington this time of year. So these two adjectives, cloudy and rainy, they're both equally modifying weather. So we could say there's a lot of rainy, cloudy weather in Seattle, Washington. That still makes sense. So because we can switch them around, we do use a comma, and then we have a city-state combination occurring mid-sentence, so we need a comma around the state Washington. And number 6, in August 1999, the couple got married in Paris, France. So we don't have a formal day, month, and year format for this date, so we don't have to worry about any commas in the informal date format, but we do have a city-state, or here it's city-country combination. So we need a comma between Paris and France. It's occurring at the end of a sentence, so we don't put a comma at the end of the sentence, we just end it with a period. If you have any questions, then please let me know. Otherwise, I'll give you 6 minutes. Please look at practice set C. Okay, so number one, the worker had on a fluorescent yellow vest. So we wouldn't be able to switch those around to say the worker had on a yellow fluorescent vest because fluorescent modifies yellow vest. Yellow modifies vest. So we can't switch them around, therefore we don't use a comma. So number one is correct as it's written. Number two, I have worked in Rockville, Maryland, and before that Greenbelt, Maryland for 2 years. So we have this parenthetical clause, and before that Greenbelt, Maryland, that kind of injects extra non-essential information, where the true essential information or meaning of the sentence is I have worked in Rockville, Maryland for 2 years. So we need commas surrounding the parenthetical clause. Number three, I would prefer not to move. What about you? We have a statement, I would prefer not to move, separated from a question, what about you? So we need a comma between the statement and the question. Number four, my oldest brother Sam is coming home March 23, 2021, versus number five that says my brother Sam is coming home on March 23rd of next year. So two things. First of all, the difference between 4 and 5. The first difference is that in number 4 we have my oldest brother Sam, and in number 5 we have just my brother Sam. So in 4, because we have that superlative adjective oldest, there's only one oldest brother. So Sam is actually non-essential information because we've already identified the individual. We've identified that it's this person's oldest brother. So Sam is non-essential information that needs to be offset by either commas or dashes. And then we have a formal date listing that's ending the sentence. So we don't need a comma after 2021 because it's not mid-sentence. If it were mid-sentence, then we would have to have a comma after the year. But we need coming home March 23rd, comma, 2021, period. 5, my brother Sam. Here we don't specify, and now unless I'm specifically trying to imply that I only have, if I have more than one brother, then I need to specify which brother I'm speaking of. So here, Sam is essential to the identification of the subject, of the individual subject. So we don't use any commas because now Sam is essential information. Also, we don't have a formal date. We don't have the year. We just have the descriptor of next year. So we don't need any commas in that portion of the sentence either, so 5 is actually correct as it's written. 6, the lumpy wet book was placed in the sun to dry. So we could also equally have said the wet lumpy book. So because we can switch these adjectives around, we do need a comma. If you have any questions, then please let me know. Otherwise, let's look at practice set D. I'll give you 6 minutes and then we'll review. Okay, let's look at these. I hope you noticed that I made two little corrections. There were two S's that dropped off in number 2 and 6. So it should be snacks, plural, and lives, singular. The singular verb, lives, for number 6. So I do apologize if that was confusing. Number 1, she worked for hours on this never-ending, boring story. So never-ending is a compound adjective there, but that stands for one adjective, one modifier. It just has more than one word in it. Now, could we say on this, she worked for hours on this boring, never-ending story? Yes, we could, right? So we can switch them around. So we do use commas. So we need a comma between never-ending and boring. Number 2, at 3 o'clock on November 20th, 2020, there will be a party with cold, fizzy refreshments and healthy, wholesome snacks in the main hall. So we have that formal date, so we need commas surrounding the year that's occurring mid-sentence. Now, cold, fizzy refreshments. We could also say fizzy, cold refreshments. So because we can switch them around, we do use a comma. And healthy, wholesome snacks. We could also say wholesome, healthy snacks. That's fine. They're both equally modifying snacks, so we can use a comma between them. Number 3, I wouldn't worry, though I never worry, because it will probably work out in the end as it always does. So I wouldn't worry, though I never worry. So though I never worry is a parenthetical clause. And you can kind of tell it doesn't really make sense without any punctuation there to separate it, because the essential meaning of this sentence is I wouldn't worry because it will probably work out in the end as it always does. So we need commas surrounding the phrase, though I never worry. Remember that when we have a dependent independent clause construction, we need a comma between the dependent and independent clause. Oftentimes, however, when we have an independent and then dependent clause construction, the comma is unnecessary. And you can see that here. It will probably work out in the end as it always does. As it always does is a dependent clause, but it's coming after an independent clause, so that's fine. This conjunction because allows us to conjoin the two independent clauses, I wouldn't worry, with it will probably work out in the end as it always does. Number 3, how many people in your group are from Fort Lauderdale, Florida? So we have a city-state combination. We need a comma between Fort Lauderdale and Florida. 5, my cousin who lives in Florida used to be a nurse. So the phrase who lives in Florida is essential to the identification of the individual, of the subject. So because it's essential information, we don't use commas, and so number 5 is correct. Now in contrast, number 6, my youngest cousin who lives in Florida. Now we have the superlative adjective youngest, which is only one person. So I've already identified, I know the individual of whom we speak when I say my youngest cousin. So the phrase who lives in Florida is actually now non-essential information and therefore must be surrounded by commas when it occurs mid-sentence. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to give you 6 more minutes. Please look at set E, and this will probably bring us up to the end of class today. But 6 minutes, and then we'll review. Okay, looking at number 1, if you watch the stars, then you are an amateur astronomer, but if you never watch the stars, then you are not an amateur astronomer. So that conditional beginning word if is really indicative of a dependent clause. If you watch the stars, that's dependent, then you are an amateur astronomer. Notice that then is a conjunction. So we have a dependent, independent clause construction. So we need a comma. Oops, trying to get the color here. We need a comma between the two clauses. If you watch the stars, then you are an amateur astronomer. But if you don't, let me get the same color, sorry. If you never watch the stars, again, dependent, then you are not an amateur astronomer. So we have this conjunction, so we need a, comma in between this dependent, independent clause construction. So we need a comma between the two if-then statements, and then we also need a comma between the overall statements themselves. So we have a dependent, independent clause construction, two dependent, independent clause constructions combined together with the conjunction but. 2, a huge blue house is being torn down and rebuilt across the street. So, are we able to reverse these adjectives? Can we say a blue huge house? No, it doesn't really make sense because we usually think of color as being more of a primary characteristic of something rather than its size. And I know that is a little bit gray, not to make a pun or anything because we're talking about color, but that is a little bit of a gray area, a little bit subjective. But with color, it usually has to go directly next to the noun that it's modifying, and it wouldn't make sense to say a blue huge house. So because we cannot switch these adjectives around, we do not use a comma. So number 2 is correct as it's written. 3, he does not have any availability on July 5th, 2021, but he may be able to meet you in August 2021 because his main project will be over by then. So we have a formal date occurring mid-sentence, so we need 2 commas surrounding the year. But the second date is not a formal date listing. It's only the month and the year, so it takes no commas. Maybe able... And then technically we need a comma before because is a conjunction. So, but he may be able to meet with you. That's an independent clause. He may be able to meet with you in August 2021 because his main project will be over by then. Those are 2 independent clauses connected by a conjunction. So we need a comma conjunction. If you have any questions, then please let me know. Number 4, that's your sister in front of the line, isn't it? So these are both contractions. So this stands for that is, and isn't stands for is not. So we have a statement, that's your sister in front of the line, and then we have a question, isn't it? So we need a comma between a statement and a question. And then we have 5 and 6. 5 says, I invited the girl with long braids to the party. 6 says, I invited Rachel, the girl with the long braids, to the party. So notice that in number 5, the girl with long braids is essential to the identification of the individual. It's essential information. So in number 5, we take no commas because the clause with long braids is necessary to identify out of all the girls, I'm speaking about the one with long braids. But in 6, I've identified Rachel by name already. So I've already identified the individual who's the subject of the sentence or of the action. So I invited Rachel, comma, the girl with the long braids, comma, to the party. The reason being is that the essential information is I invited Rachel to the party. The girl with long braids now is non-essential and parenthetical. Therefore, when it occurs mid-sentence, it has to be surrounded by commas. If you have any questions, then please, please, please let me know. If you find these videos helpful, please like and subscribe to the stream. Oh, you're very welcome, Mark. Thank you very much for your comment. And also, you can look in my description, in the description for the video. Please follow and friend me on my social media. I just do all of my tutoring on my social media, and I've started to do the SAT questions of the day. So I'll keep pace with our lessons here, and I'll also be putting out a lot of recordings. So keep posted on my channel. If you have any questions, even in general with your academic activities or anything like that, feel free to correspond on my Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. But otherwise, Dr. Tot, do you want to say goodbye to everybody? Come on, you guys say goodbye. Come on. Come on. Just say goodbye to everybody. You say bye? Can you say bye? Come on, you can say bye. Bye. Say bye. Okay, good boy. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'll talk to you all tomorrow on Friday for our math session.